What kind of man turns down a palace? What kind of leader steps away from splendor and chooses simplicity instead? And what does one quiet room say not just about power, but about presence? These are the questions we begin with, not to glorify minimalism, but to understand a deeper act of mindfulness in one of the loudest halls of power. He could have lived among gold-trimmed ceilings, beneath paintings, worth more than most of us will ever see in a lifetime. The Vatican Apostolic Palace, a place built to reflect divine power, was ready for him, waiting. Lavishly historic, spiritually iconic, politically expected, but Pope Francis said no. Instead, he chose a room modest, quiet, unadorned, tucked away in the Domus Sanctae Marthae, a guest house inside Vatican walls usually reserved for visiting cardinals. And with that choice, he didn't just surprise the church, he surprised the world. This wasn't a matter of comfort. It wasn't a moment of false humility. It wasn't even about setting an example, not in the way we usually think. This was a statement, a signal, a shift. He was stepping into the role of the most recognized spiritual figure on earth. But from the very beginning, he chose to do it differently. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis, all eyes were on him. The church held its breath. The world waited to see who he would become now that he wore the white robes. And the first test came almost immediately. Where would he live? For centuries, every newly elected pope moved into the apostolic palace without question. Its grandeur was seen not only as tradition, but as a natural reflection of the role's holiness. But within days, Francis declined. Gently, firmly. And with that, the message was clear. This would be a different kind of papacy. This wasn't about rejecting beauty. It was about rejecting separation, rejecting the silent walls that power tends to build. He chose to live not above others, but among them, and that small act echoed louder than any sermon. In this video, we'll explore why this simple room matters. We'll trace this decision through the story of Francis himself, his past, his principles, his faith, and what it reveals about leadership, humility, and the kind of quiet strength our modern world so deeply needs. Let's begin, not with a title, but with a room, and the choice that quietly shook centuries of tradition. Now, let's take a closer look at why small choices, like where one lives, often say more than the grandest words ever could. His choice of a simple room wasn't just the beginning of something different, it was the reflection of something long believed, long practiced, and long lived. Pope Francis has always believed that true greatness does not shout. It doesn't arrive in trumpets or robes or high ceilings. It whispers in small, consistent choices, in daily acts that quietly reflect what we hold sacred inside. To him, choosing where to live had nothing to do with luxury or discomfort. It was never about soft pillows or stone floors. It was about alignment, about integrity, about making sure that what he preached from the pulpit was mirrored by how he moved through each day. He once said, "We must recover the simplicity of life, to know how to renounce what harms the soul." This idea, the return to simplicity, isn't just a nice sentiment, it's a compass. It points toward the values we want to embody. Simplicity becomes a way of clarifying what matters, what weighs us down, and what distances us from one another. By refusing the palace, Pope Francis wasn't turning his back on beauty. He was rejecting the distance. The kind of distance that power, even sacred power, so often builds between people. That unspoken message of, "You are there, and I am here." But Francis wanted no such walls. To understand why this mattered so deeply to him, we must step back further into his life. Born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Jorge Mario Bergoglio came from humble roots. His family was modest. His experiences were grounded. He rode public buses. He walked through poor neighborhoods. He sat with the voiceless. He never stopped. Even as a cardinal, when power had already begun to surround him, he lived in a small apartment. He cooked his own meals. He avoided the pomp and formality that so often isolate leaders from the world they serve. He didn't study poverty as an idea. He lived among it. He learned its language. And more importantly, he understood that poverty was not only an economic state, it was an emotional reality for millions. This closeness shaped his leadership. It made him someone who led not from above, but from beside. Someone who didn't need titles to connect. Someone who broke barriers simply by refusing to let them define him. So when the world asked why he rejected the palace, the answer was never about minimalism. It was about memory. It was about relationship. It was about presence. Because to Francis, the palace was never just a building. It was a symbol of hierarchy, of history, of distance, dressed in splendor. And by turning it down, he wasn't making a political statement alone. He was making a spiritual one that called the church not forward into flash, but back into service, back into humility, back into what it was always meant to be. In a world that constantly celebrates the external, the image, the brand, the performance, Pope Francis turned gently toward the internal, toward the essence. And as we continue, we'll see that where he chose to live wasn't the only space he chose to redefine. It was only the beginning. After stepping away from tradition and into the simplicity of Domus Sanctae Marthae, Pope Francis didn't just redefine the role of a spiritual leader. He redefined how that leader lives, eats, walks, and connects. Domus Sanctae Marthae is not isolated. It's not guarded like a fortress, nor closed off like a royal estate. It breathes. It moves. Priests walk its halls. Guests come and go. Staff carry out their daily work. And in the middle of it all, Pope Francis lives. He doesn't dine in solitude. He eats with others. He doesn't wait behind closed doors. He opens his own. He walks hallways, exchanges greetings, shares smiles, and speaks not from a throne, but from eye level. This isn't just a practical choice, it's a spiritual one. Because Francis believes deeply in what might be called a spirituality of proximity, a closeness that is not just physical, but relational. It tears down the invisible walls that privilege so often builds walls that say, I am up here, and you are down there. And in doing so, he teaches us something profound, that God is not hidden behind gates, nor sealed in marble rooms. God is in the human encounter, in the handshake, in the shared meal, in the ordinary. But such presence, such nearness, comes at a cost. Many leaders, religious and secular alike, are drawn to status, to titles, to the illusion of control that distance brings. It can be tempting to choose insulation over interaction. After all, insulation feels safer. It protects from criticism, discomfort, even vulnerability. Francis, however, saw early in his life that isolation doesn't protect. It erodes. It feeds the ego. And ego, when fed too long, creates disconnection from others, from truth, and from God. So he made a conscious choice to live simply, not just in physical surroundings, but in posture of heart. That simplicity created space, not just in his schedule, but in his soul. A space where stillness could live. This stillness is not passive. It is alive. It is the stillness of clarity, of presence, of knowing who you are and why you are here. It is the kind of stillness that allows you to stand tall in silence, even when others expect performance. Not everyone embraced this. Some felt his choices, his room, his clothes, his demeanor were a rejection of papal dignity, that he was minimizing the role. But Francis wasn't trying to impress the church. He was trying to restore its center. So when criticism came, he met it the same way he meets the world, not with anger, not with defense, but with calm, compassion, and quiet certainty. And that calm sparked conversation. Around the world, people began to ask, what should spiritual leadership look like in our time? What does sacredness mean in the 21st century? Francis didn't try to modernize Catholicism by adding. He tried to rehumanize it by stripping away, to return it to something real, grounded, accessible. To him, holiness isn't distant. It isn't draped in gold. It's real, and it lives not in rituals alone, but in everyday life. But here's the truth. This isn't just a story about a pope. It's a story about us. What palaces, visible or invisible, are we still living in? What versions of power or comfort keep us apart from others, or even from ourselves? Where are we choosing performance over honesty, distance over connection, safety over soul? By choosing a small room, Pope Francis doesn't just invite us to admire his humility. He invites us to join him, to look inward, to live aligned with what we truly believe. And as we move to the final part of this journey, let's pause and ask, what would happen if we walked away from our own palace? In a world that constantly competes to be louder, bigger, and faster, Pope Francis chose none of those things. He didn't shout, he didn't demand, he didn't seek applause. He simply walked quietly in a different direction. And that is exactly why the world stopped to look. He turned down the palace. He turned away from prestige. And in doing so, he turned toward people. Not to impress, not to perform, but to be present. Because real leadership doesn't always come from a platform. Sometimes it comes from a shared table, a hallway conversation, a room with a single light. In that quiet space, Pope Francis led not with power but with presence. And in that presence lies something unmistakably sacred. This is the revolution we often miss. Not the one that roars, but the one that whispers. So, as you leave this video, pause. Ask yourself, what direction are you quietly walking in? And what is your small act of truth that might, just might, be louder than you think? If this story stirred something within you, let it linger, let it lead you, and let it remind you. Sometimes, the smallest rooms hold the greatest light. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Leave a comment. Your voice is part of this journey. If it touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a quiet revolution too. And don't forget to subscribe to Mindful Way Television, ***, where silence, simplicity, and soul still matter. Ready for another story like this? Our next video dives even deeper into what it means to lead not with a crown, but with compassion. We'll see you there. Until then, stay grounded, stay open, and keep walking your mindful way.